everyone, this is Tabitha and my dog Max, who decided to join me for this video. And today I'm just going to be talking about how I memorize lines. If you are a theater person, obviously you know that memorizing lines is a huge deal when it comes to performing in shows. And it's really crazy because I didn't realize, just because I've been doing theater since I was 11, I didn't realize how much of a skill it is to be able to memorize a large amount of lines, just because I grew up watching people do it. So I guess I never realized it was difficult until I started talking to people and noticing that when people do theater as adults for the first time, that's usually the thing that they're the most nervous about, is memorizing lines, or that's usually what they have the most struggles with. So if you've never had to memorize a huge amount of lines before, this video is for you. And even if you're a theater person that's been doing it for a while, if you just notice it's something you're always struggling with, or is just kind of random and you really have no control over how well you're memorizing lines, keep watching as well. I am definitely not an expert on this subject at all, so I would love some more advice if you have any in the comments below. Will say I do consider myself a capable memorizer, just because I've never been one to, so far, knock on, oh, there's no wood, knock on Pomeranian, there has never been a case where I have dropped a line in a live show so far. Obviously, now that I said that, there's gonna be horrible luck coming my way, but I've never dropped a line in a show. And while I have struggled during rehearsal with lines, it's never been like, oh my gosh, is she gonna ruin the show? I've never had that happen, but you never know. Also, while I was in grad school a few years ago, I was a tour guide at Radio City Music Hall, and that by far is the most pressure-filled situation as far as memorizing lines I've ever been in before in my life. So I had to memorize it verbatim, 36 pages, and we really only got maybe 2 weeks, but the thing was that they would ask for like 8 pages at a time within like a night. So I've memorized 8 pages of a tour of history before in just one night. So I feel like after that experience, memorizing a few lines for a show doesn't seem that scary. That was kind of a trial by fire moment. And so I just always remind myself whenever I'm struggling with lines is, hey, you memorized a 36-page monologue basically in not a lot of time. You totally got this. So here are just some of the tactics I use to memorize lines. So I'm just using this as an example because this is actually the show that I'm in right now. I'm in The Glass Menagerie and I'm playing Laura. Laura's kind of easy though, not gonna lie, because she doesn't really talk that much. She is a shy character. Most of her talking comes in Act 2, and it's in a scene with just one other person. So it's a lot of back and forth, but obviously that does come with its own downsides as well. I've definitely played a lot more talkative characters before. Just before this, I played Shelby in Steel Magnolias, and she is a much more talkative character. So depending on what character you have, you may be dealing with more or less line memorization. The most I think I've ever had to memorize was when I played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, because obviously she's on basically the entire show and she talks a lot, so that's probably the most amount of lines I've had to memorize for a show. But as far as things I do, the first thing I recommend is, I know this is really basic, but highlighting your lines. I know people always see theater people do this, but it's not just because it looks pretty. I do like the way it looks, but it does help when you're memorizing. If anything, just by remembering, a lot of people are visual learners, so just remembering where a line is on a page and what it looks like on your page can help you out with memorizing lines. It does help when you're at rehearsal and you're not off book yet, for you to know exactly where your lines are. They literally jump off the page for you. And then when you're memorizing, it does help you find your lines a lot quicker. I feel like things would go a lot slower if my lines weren't highlighted. I know sometimes you're not allowed to highlight your script, if like you have to give it back to the company afterwards, so I totally understand if you can't, but if you are in the situation where you're able to write and highlight inside your script, I totally recommend it. Something else I do when I'm memorizing lines is I try to do a little bit at a time. Break it up. Like for example, if I know that I have a 15-minute break in my day, maybe I just focus on one page. And that sounds kind of ridiculous, but maybe I have 3 15-minute breaks in a day, and each break I focus on one page. At the end of the day, I've worked on 3 pages and I know them really, really well. That doesn't mean I never have to practice them again, obviously, but it means that I really took the time to memorize those 3 pages and get familiar with those lines rather than trying to memorize an entire scene in 15 minutes. For example, in this first page, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. The main thing that I tell kids this, because kids forget this all the time, you don't just memorize your line, you have to memorize your cue line. So that means whatever the person before your line says, that cues in your line. That's not just for memorizing lines, that's also for acting, to know why the heck is your character saying this? What are they responding to? What's going on in the play? Sometimes the cue line isn't even a line, it could be an action. So for example, some lines don't make sense if you're not waiting for an action. So for example, in Glass Menagerie, my mother is supposed to rip up something that belongs to me, and then I have to say, "Why did you do that, mother?" So my cue line shouldn't be her line before. I have to literally wait until she rips up my chart, because if I just say, "Why did you do that, mother?" after she talks and she didn't actually do anything dramatic, I sound a little crazy. So what I do is I look at the line right before it. So for example, my first line comes right after my mom says, "You smoke too much." So that's a pretty memorable line in my opinion. That's not super difficult to remember. So my first line, "Mother, I'll bring in the coffee." So first I try to think of a reason why my character is saying something. I know this seems like I'm going a little bit more into character development, but it does help you memorize lines, because instead of just memorizing things like a robot, if you know why your character is saying something in response to something else, it makes it a lot quicker. So "You smoke too much" is my mother bothering my brother for the millionth time, and I think my character is probably trying to change the subject because she hates when her mother and her brother fight. So, "You smoke too much." Ooh, okay, she's bothering my brother on smoke. I have to talk, I should say something. "Mother, I'll bring in the coffee." So what I do is I'll read it, just look at it with my eyes. I'll read it 3 times, and then I'll flip my book over and do it in my head 3 times. But when I'm doing it in my head, I also go from "you smoke too much." So I say, "You smoke too much, mother, I'll bring in the coffee." "You smoke too much, mother, I'll bring in the coffee." "You smoke too much, mother, I'll bring in the coffee." And I see if I can do it 3 times without looking at my book. Now I know that seems really easy, but for some lines that are longer, it does take a bunch of tries. So for example, if you look at this page, I have this big block of text. If I was playing Amanda, who's the mother character, she has huge monologues, and that is a whole different animal. So maybe at another point I can talk about how I memorize monologues, which I do very differently. But if it's just a longer line, not so much a monologue, but it's just longer, I do it the same way. It just usually takes more tries. So I'll read it a bunch of times more, try it, probably mess up, and then when I mess up, I look at it again, and just keep doing it until I finally get to the place where I can say it correctly without looking at the book. So that's my first step. That's my first way of getting through. Like I said, I'll go through as slowly as I can while still meeting all the demands of the director and when your show is. Like for example, usually directors tell you when all of Act 1 needs to be memorized. So I've never been this talented, but some people make schedules for themselves. I don't have time for that, so I just try my best to get it done on time. And you go through the lines. Something else that's important is, let's say I memorize my first page. Something that a lot of first timers do is that they'll never go back and look at the first page ever again. And that's a huge mistake because we're humans and we forget things. So what I'll do is I won't go through the whole saying it 3 times without looking at the page again. But let's say I had my 15-minute break and I got my first page down. When I get my next break, before going on to my second page, I'll skim the first page so it's not completely foreign to me, and I go on to page 2, so that you never really stop practicing the lines that you did before, because otherwise you'll just forget the first ones and you'll only remember the ones you did most recently, because that's how the human brain works. Something else I do that really helps a lot is I record myself saying my lines. So I know they actually have a bunch of apps for that. I haven't used any, so if you have ever used an app to memorize lines that you found helpful, please let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to try that. but all I really do are as voice memos. I will, using my script, just because if anything that helps me memorize too, reading everything again and out loud. I'll record my cue lines and my lines, and I won't really focus too much on the acting because this is just for the memorizing, because I feel like once the lines are ingrained in your brain, you can have a lot more fun with acting, but it's really hard to do it when you don't know what you're saying. So, for example, this is really embarrassing.
You smoke too much. Mother, I'll bring in the coffee. You're going to be the lady. I'm already up.
So, I don't know if you can tell, but I try to change my voice when I'm not my character so I can differentiate which are my cue lines and which are my actual lines. And I literally go through the entire show. I only do my cue lines and my lines. So if I have a big bunch where my character doesn't talk, like this, I just completely skip it. And it's actually really funny because in Glass Menagerie, like I said, Laura doesn't talk too much. So altogether, the entire show, I have about 18 minutes of me on a voice recording, which is not a lot really when you think about the fact that the show is like 2 hours long, but if you put all of Laura's lines together, she's really only talking for 18 minutes. So I don't have too much to complain about, but like I said, I've used this tactic with other parts that talk a lot more. And the reason I do this is because, I don't know about you guys, but I tend to do shows that are kind of a drive out from where I live. So, for example, for Steel Magnolias, that was half an hour away from me. I've done shows 40 minutes away. This one actually is the furthest. It's 45 minutes away from where I live, and sometimes if the traffic is a lot, it's even longer. So what's the point of listening to the radio when I can just listen to my lines? So that's 45 minutes going and coming. That is an hour and a half of time memorizing lines. And just think about how easy it is for you to just zone out and listen to music while you're driving. It has been such a godsend, those drives, as far as memorizing my lines. I'll put my maps on and I'll just hit my voice recording, and it's basically an 18-minute song that I'm driving to, and as soon as it's over, I just play it again. And it's funny because I'll try to say the lines with myself, like trying to remember everything, and then when I realize, oh, I don't know this one, I have to hear myself say it. But the repetition is really, really useful. It's also useful to me because I'm a teacher. I don't have a lot of free time during the school year to memorize a lot of lines. So some weeks that's literally the time I have to memorize lines. So that drive is really, really helpful. And I found that to be a really helpful way to memorize lines, just driving, talking along with my own recording and saying all my lines. Like I said, I only say my cue lines and my lines. Not just helpful for rides to rehearsal, but you can technically do it to your drives anywhere. If you have a long commute to work, why not? So that can be done from day one. You can do your recording for your car. Oh, those are the steps I use to memorize lines. So I know some people, they try to memorize blocking along with their lines. I feel like I've tried that and it just hasn't worked because lines don't really change, because legally directors can't really change lines on you, but they can change blocking. I've had blocking change very frequently, especially for this show. We rehearsed in a space thinking the stage was going to look a certain way, and then once we moved to the stage, it was completely different, and a lot of things just got completely upended and our blocking completely changed. So I don't like to memorize blocking and lines together just because I'm afraid that if the blocking changes, it'll mess up my line memorization, if that makes any sense. So I like to have my lines memorized completely independently of any blocking or movement. And I memorize blocking basically with repetition, which I know can be hard if you're in a really fast-paced environment when you're not repeating the blocking a million times or there is a last-minute change. But I've just started doing that because focusing on memorizing blocking and then having a director change it on you the next rehearsal is really frustrating. So I just do my best to practice my blocking as far as physically doing it over and over, but when I'm memorizing lines, I am just focusing on the lines, so at least those are ingrained in my brain. So that's about it as far as memorizing lines. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye!